Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Andy, I'm a portrait photographer, and today I'm going to share to you about aperture and what actually aperture does to camera. Please check it out. Thank you. First, I'm sharing to you about aperture and what aperture actually does to camera. Aperture is one of the three pillars of photography, the other two being shutter speed and ISO, and certainly the most important. In this article, we go through everything you need to know about aperture and how it works. What is the meaning of aperture? Aperture can be defined as the opening in a lens through which light passes to enter the camera. It is an easy concept to understand if you think how your eyes work. As you move between bright and dark environments, the iris in your eyes either expands or shrinks, so controlling the size of your pupil. In photography, the pupil of your lens is called aperture. You can shrink or enlarge the size of the aperture to allow more or less light to reach your camera sensor, such as this example. Aperture can add dimension to your photos by controlling depths of field. Aperture gives you a blurred background with a beautiful shallow focus effect. Aperture, it will give you sharp photos from the nearby foreground to the distant horizon. On top of that, it also changes the exposure of your images by making them brighter or darker. How aperture affects our exposure. Aperture has several effects on your images. One of the most important is the brightness or exposure of your images. As aperture changes in size, it alters the overall amount of light that reaches your camera sensor, and therefore the brightness of your image. Large aperture will pass a lot of light, resulting in a brighter photograph. A small aperture does just the opposite, making the photo darker. Please have a look in this example. In a dark environment, for instance indoors or at night, you will probably want to select a large aperture to capture as much as light possible. This is the same reason why your pupils dilate when it starts to get dark. How aperture affects depths of field. How aperture affects depths of field. Depth of field is the amount of your photograph that appears sharp from front to back. Some images have a thin or shallow depth of field where the background is completely out of focus. Other images have a large or deep depth of field where both the foreground and background are sharp. In this example, you can see the girl is in focus and appears sharp, while the background is completely out of focus. The choice of aperture played a big role here. I especially use a large aperture in order to create a shallow focus effect. This helped me to bring the attention of the viewer to the subject rather than busy background. One trick to remember this relationship: a large aperture results in a large amount of both foreground and background blur. This is often desirable for portraits or general photos of objects where you want to isolate the subject. On the other hand, a small aperture results in a small amount of background blur, which is typically ideal for some types of photography such as landscape and architecture. I used a small aperture to ensure that both my background and foreground were as sharp as possible from front to back. Here is a quick comparison that shows the difference between using a large versus a small aperture. As you can see, the photograph on the left only has the head of the lizard appearing in focus and sharp, with both foreground and background transitioning into blur, whereas the photo on the right has everything from front to back appearing sharp. What are Fstop and Fnumber? So far, we have only discussed aperture in general terms like large and small. However, it can also be expressed as a number known as Fnumber or Fstop, with the letter F appearing before the number. For example, like F/8. Most likely, you have noticed this on your camera before. On your LCD screen or viewfinder, your aperture will look something like this: F/2, F/3.5, F/8, and so on and on. Some cameras omit the slash and write Fstop like this: F2, F3.5, F8, and so on and on. So, Fstop are a way to describing the size of aperture for a particular photo. There is a catch. One important part of aperture that confusing any beginner photographer more than anything else. This is something you really need to pay attention and get correct. Small numbers represent large apertures, whereas large numbers represent small apertures. I repeat again. Small numbers represent large apertures, whereas large numbers represent small apertures. That's not a typo. For example, F/2.8 is larger than F/4 and much larger than F/11. Most people find this awkward since we are used to having large numbers represent large values. This is basic fact of photography. This causes huge amount of confusion among photographers because it is completely the reverse of what you would expect at first. However, as strange as it may sound, there is a reasonable and simple explanation that should make it much clearer to you. Aperture is a fraction. I repeat again. Aperture is a fraction. How to choose the right aperture? Now you are familiar with some specific examples of Fstop. How do you know what aperture to use for your photos? Let's jump back to exposure and depth of field, the two most important effects of aperture. Please have a look carefully to this diagram. Just imagine if you are in a darker environment, maybe you want to use large aperture like f2.8 to capture a photo of the proper brightness. For depths of field, if you use a large aperture value like f2.8, will result in a large amount of background blur, ideal for shallow focus portraits, while values like f8, f11, or f16 will help you capture sharp details in both foreground and background. Please don't be afraid if your photo is too bright or dark at your chosen aperture setting. Most of the time, you will be able to adjust your shutter speed to compensate, or raise your ISO if you have hit your sharp shutter speed limit. Be happy. Smile, please. How to set aperture in your camera? Setting aperture in your camera. If you want to select your aperture manually in your camera for a photo, which is something we highly recommend, there are two modes which work very well. First, aperture priority mode. Second, manual mode. Aperture priority mode is written as A or AV on most cameras, while manual is written as M. Usually, you can find these on the top of dial of your camera easily. Minimum and maximum aperture. Minimum and maximum aperture. a lens that has a maximum aperture, for instance f1.4 or f1.8, is considered to be fast lens because it can pass through more light than others. In contrast, the minimum aperture is not that important because almost all modern lenses can provide at least f16 at the minimum. Thank you very much for watching me. If you like it, please thumbs up. If you love it, please subscribe. Thank you so much.